Free haircut? Pack your things now. The shop owner's voice echoed through the entire barbershop. 73-year-old Henry Thompson, the master barber, slowly set down his straight razor. The young soldier sitting across from him froze. Henry had worked in this shop for 6 years, and he had simply shown kindness to a veteran. But 2 hours later, the 3 military vehicles parked at the end of the street, and 20 Marines in uniform would leave everyone speechless. Henry Thompson had been cutting hair for over 40 years. His hands, weathered by time and steady as a surgeon's, had shaped the heads of 3 generations in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The small barbershop on Main Street wasn't much to look at. Red, white, and blue poles spinning endlessly, cracked leather chairs that had seen better decades, and walls lined with faded photographs of young men in uniform from wars spanning back to Vietnam. Henry's own service photo hung behind the register, a 19-year-old kid in army greens, fresh-faced and ready to serve in Korea. That was 1968, a lifetime ago. But some things never left you: the discipline, the respect for those who wore the uniform, and the understanding that came with walking in those boots. He'd opened his own shop after the service, built a reputation for precision cuts and warm conversation. Men came not just for haircuts, but for the stories, the laughter, and the quiet wisdom that came with age. Henry never charged much. He didn't need to. His wife Margaret's pension and his small savings were enough for their simple life. But when Margaret passed 3 years ago, Henry found himself working not for money, but for purpose. The empty house felt too quiet. The barbershop became his sanctuary, and his customers became his family. Especially the young soldiers from Fort Riley, an hour's drive away, who sometimes stopped by on their way home. Henry always gave them a little extra, sharper fade, extra attention to detail, sometimes a story about the old days. And if one of them looked down on their luck, well, Henry remembered what it was like to come home with empty pockets and a head full of memories you couldn't shake. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under his feet as Henry unlocked the shop at 7 a.m. sharp. Mr. Davidson, the building owner, was already there, clipboard in hand, going over the monthly numbers. Davidson was a businessman first, community member second. Everything was profit margins and efficiency reports with him. "Henry," Davidson said, not looking up from his paperwork, "I need to talk to you about keeping costs down. The electric bill was higher last month." Henry nodded politely, tying his apron around his waist. At 73, he'd learned when to speak and when to simply listen. Davidson meant well, but he'd never understood that some things couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. The morning passed quietly. A few regulars, some small talk about the weather and the high school football team. Henry's hands moved with practiced precision, each snip deliberate, each conversation genuine. This was more than work. It was craft, passed down through generations of barbers who understood that a good haircut could change a man's day. Around 2 p.m., the bell above the door chimed, and in walked someone Henry hadn't seen before. The young man was maybe 25, wearing a wrinkled army uniform, his hair grown out well beyond regulation. His boots were scuffed. His eyes carried that distant look Henry recognized from his own mirror decades ago. "Afternoon," Henry said warmly, gesturing to the empty chair. "What can I do for you, son?" The soldier hesitated at the doorway, glancing around the shop nervously. I was wondering about a haircut, military regulation." "Of course," Henry smiled, patting the chair. "Come on in. What's your name?" "Marcus Rivera," the young man said, settling into the chair. "Just got back from deployment. Need to look presentable for some job interviews." Henry draped the cape around Marcus's shoulders, studying his reflection in the mirror. The kid looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. His uniform was clean but worn, pressed but showing age. Henry had seen this before, soldiers coming home to uncertainty, carrying invisible wounds alongside their duffel bags. "Where were you stationed?" Henry asked, running his fingers through Marcus's hair, assessing the work needed. "Afghanistan. 15 months. Marcus replied quietly. "Finally made it home last week." Henry nodded, firing up the clippers. "Welcome home, son. Thank you for your service." As he worked, Henry drew out Marcus's story in the gentle way he'd perfected over decades. The young man had grown up in foster care, joined the army at 18 with no family to speak of. The military had become his family, his brothers in arms the closest thing to home he'd ever known. But now he was back in civilian life, staying at a cheap motel, living off his final paycheck while looking for work. "Haven't had a proper haircut in months," Marcus admitted. "Kept meaning to find a place, but—" He trailed off, and Henry understood. Sometimes the simplest tasks felt insurmountable when you were carrying the weight of the world. Henry worked with extra care, taking his time to ensure every line was perfect, every edge clean. This wasn't just a haircut, it was preparation for a new chapter, a fresh start. He'd seen how a good haircut could change a man's posture, his confidence, his entire outlook. As Henry put the finishing touches on the fade, he caught sight of Mr. Davidson in the corner, arms crossed, watching with a frown. Henry had been taking longer than usual, he knew, but some customers deserved extra attention. "There you go," Henry said finally, brushing loose hair from Marcus's shoulders. "Sharp as a Marine." Marcus smiled for the first time since walking in, studying himself in the mirror. The transformation was remarkable, the overgrown hair replaced by a crisp, military-precise cut that made him look younger, more confident, ready to take on the world. "How much do I owe you?" Marcus asked, reaching for his wallet. Henry watched as the young man counted out crumpled bills, mostly ones and fives. He could see it was probably all the cash Marcus had to his name. The total should have been $25, but Henry saw something in those eyes, pride fighting with desperation, hope wrestling with uncertainty. "You know what, son?" Henry said, pushing the money gently back toward Marcus. "This one's on the house. Welcome home gift." Marcus's eyes widened. "Sir, I can't let you." "Nonsense," Henry interrupted, waving him off. "You served our country. Least I can do is serve you a proper haircut." That's when Mr. Davidson stepped forward, his face red with anger. "What did you just do?" Davidson's voice was sharp, cutting through the warm atmosphere like a blade. Henry turned, still calm. "I gave this young man a haircut." "Free haircut? Pack your things now," Davidson exploded. "Henry, I've told you before about giving away services. This is a business, not a charity." The barbershop fell silent, except for the humming of the overhead fan. Marcus sat frozen in the chair, cape still around his shoulders, watching the confrontation unfold. Other customers who had been waiting looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or leave. Henry's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a lifetime of controlled anger finally finding a crack to seep through. In 40 years of cutting hair, he'd never been dressed down like a child in front of customers, especially not for showing kindness to a veteran. "Mr. Davidson," Henry said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm building inside. "This young man just spent 15 months serving our country in Afghanistan. I think he's earned a free haircut." Davidson wasn't backing down. "I don't care if he was on Mars. Free services hurt the bottom line. You want to play charity, do it with your own money, not mine." The shop grew even quieter, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums. Marcus started to stand, fumbling with the cape. "Sir, please, let me pay." "Sit down, son," Henry said firmly, his hand gently pressing Marcus back into the chair. "This has nothing to do with you." But Davidson was just getting started. 6 years, Henry. 6 years you've worked here, and you still don't understand basic business principles. This bleeding heart nonsense stops today. Henry untied his apron with deliberate slowness, his movements carrying the weight of a man who'd made his decision. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Davidson. I understand that some things matter more than money." "Not in my shop they don't," Davidson snapped. "Clear out your station. You're done here." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Henry folded his apron neatly, placed it on the counter next to his tools, the scissors that had been sharpened 1,000 times, the combs worn smooth by decades of use, the straight razor that had been his grandfather's. Marcus finally found his voice, standing abruptly and pulling out his wallet again. "Please, sir, I have the money. Don't fire him over me." Henry placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Keep your money, son. You'll need it for those job interviews." He turned to Davidson. "And you can keep your job. Some things are worth more than a paycheck." As Henry gathered his personal items, the old photographs, a coffee mug that read "World's Greatest Barber," a gift from Margaret, and a small American flag pin, the other customers watched in stunned silence. One elderly regular, Tom Miller, stood up from his waiting chair. "Henry," Tom said, his voice gruff with emotion, "this is wrong. You're the best barber this town's ever had." "Thank you, Tom," Henry replied, shaking the man's hand. "Take care of yourself." Marcus was still standing by the chair, looking lost. "Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." Henry stopped and looked at the young soldier, really looked at him. In that moment, he saw every veteran he'd ever served, every young man who'd come home carrying invisible wounds, every person who'd ever needed a moment of kindness in a world that seemed to have forgotten what kindness looked like. "Son," Henry said, his voice gentle but firm, "don't you ever apologize for being worth someone's kindness. You served your country with honor. I honored you with a haircut. That's not something to be sorry about. That's something to be proud of." With that, Henry Thompson walked out of the barber shop where he'd worked for 6 years, his head held high, his conscience clear. Behind him, Davidson was already on his phone, probably calling a replacement barber service. What none of them knew was that Marcus Rivera wasn't just any soldier returning from deployment. He was a decorated Marine who'd saved his entire unit during an ambush in Kandahar. The phone call he made as soon as Henry left the shop wasn't to a friend or family member. It was to Colonel James Mitchell, his former commanding officer, who happened to be in charge of veteran relations at the nearest Marine base. And Colonel Mitchell had some very strong opinions about how veterans should be treated in civilian life. 2 hours later, as Henry sat in his empty house, still trying to process what had happened, the quiet street outside suddenly came alive with the rumble of diesel engines. 3 military vehicles, 2 Humvees and a transport truck, rolled down Main Street like a parade of purpose. They parked in front of Davidson's barber shop with precision that would have made a drill sergeant proud. Doors opened in perfect synchronization, and out stepped 20 Marines in full dress uniforms, their buttons gleaming, their posture unshakable. At their head walked Colonel Mitchell, a man whose chest was lined with ribbons that told stories of courage under fire, leadership in chaos, and a commitment to the brotherhood that extended far beyond active duty. The Marines formed a perfect line outside the barber shop, their presence impossible to ignore. Passers-by stopped and stared. Cars slowed down. The entire block seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Mitchell walked through the door alone, his boots echoing against the tile floor. "Mr. S." Davidson looked up from his paperwork, his face draining of color as he took in the sight of a full-bird colonel standing in his barber shop. "Are you Mr. Davidson?" the colonel asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made generals pay attention. Davidson nodded, suddenly unable to find his voice. "I understand you fired Henry Thompson this afternoon," Mitchell continued, his tone conversational but his eyes steel-hard. "Over a free haircut given to one of my Marines." It was a business decision," Davidson stammered. "Nothing personal." Colonel Mitchell stepped closer to the counter, his presence filling the small shop. "Mr. Davidson, let me tell you about Marcus Rivera. Staff Sergeant Rivera spent 15 months in Afghanistan. He was awarded the Bronze Star for valor after he carried 3 wounded Marines to safety under enemy fire. He saved lives, sir, American lives." The colonel paused, letting the words sink in. "And when he came home and needed a haircut for job interviews, Henry Thompson, a Korean War veteran himself, honored that service with kindness, and you fired him for it." Davidson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Outside, the Marines stood at attention, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers who pulled out phones and started recording. "Sir, I run a business," Davidson finally managed. "I can't afford to give away free services." "Can't afford?" Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Davidson, that free haircut cost you $25. But firing Henry Thompson just cost you something much more valuable, your reputation." The colonel gestured toward the window, where the crowd outside was growing larger by the minute. "Those Marines out there represent thousands of veterans in this state who are going to hear about how you treated a fellow veteran, how you valued $25 more than honor." Davidson was sweating now, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. "Colonel, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," Mitchell cut him off. "You saw a uniform and a man showing kindness, and your first instinct was profit, not pride." The colonel turned to look at the photographs on the wall. Decades of young men in uniform, customers who had trusted their appearance to Henry Thompson's skilled hands. This barbershop has served military families for years. Henry Thompson has honored that tradition, and you threw it away. Outside, local news crews were arriving, alerted by the social media posts that were already going viral. The sight of 20 Marines in dress uniforms standing guard outside a barbershop was the kind of image that demanded explanation. Colonel Mitchell pulled out his phone and made a call. "Henry, this is Colonel Mitchell, Marcus Rivera's commanding officer. I'm standing in Davidson's barbershop right now, and I think there's something you should see." 20 minutes later, Henry Thompson walked down Main Street toward his former workplace, his steps slower now, uncertain. The crowd parted as he approached, people pointing and whispering. He'd never been the center of this kind of attention, and it made him uncomfortable. But when he saw the Marines standing at attention, when he recognized the respect in their posture and the purpose in their presence, something shifted in his chest. This wasn't about him. This was about something bigger, the covenant between those who serve and those who honor that service. Colonel Mitchell stepped out of the shop and approached Henry, his hand extended. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Colonel Mitchell. I believe you know Staff Sergeant Rivera." Henry shook the colonel's hand, still bewildered by the scene around him. "I just gave the boy a haircut, Colonel. Nothing more." "Sir, you did much more than that," Mitchell replied. "You reminded him that his service mattered, that he mattered. In a world that often forgets its heroes, you remembered." The colonel gestured to the Marines behind him. These men wanted to meet the barber who honored one of their own. They wanted to say thank you. What happened next would be remembered in Cedar Falls for generations. 20 Marines, in perfect unison, raised their hands in salute to a 73-year-old Korean War veteran who had shown kindness to one of their brothers. The crowd fell silent, phones recording a moment of pure respect that transcended rank, age, and circumstance. Henry Thompson, his eyes wet with tears he didn't try to hide, returned the salute with the precision of a man who had never forgotten what it meant to serve. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The viral videos and news coverage painted a clear picture of the confrontation, and the court of public opinion delivered its verdict quickly. Davidson's barbershop, which had operated for decades as a community institution, suddenly found itself empty of customers. Veterans groups organized boycotts. Local businesses pulled their support. The landlord, facing pressure from the community and negative publicity, chose not to renew Davidson's lease when it expired the following month. But the real victory wasn't in Davidson's downfall. It was in what rose from the ashes of that confrontation. Henry Thompson received dozens of job offers from barbershops across the state. But the one that mattered most came from an unexpected source: Marcus Rivera himself. Using his veterans' benefits and a small business loan, Marcus opened Thompson and Rivera Barbershop just 3 blocks down from the old location. The new shop was everything the old one had been, but more. The walls were lined with military photographs, but also pictures of the community, families, children, everyday heroes who deserved to be remembered. A sign by the door read, "All veterans receive complimentary services, not because we have to, but because we want to." The shop's grand opening drew hundreds of people. Local news covered the ribbon-cutting ceremony, where Henry Thompson, wearing a brand new apron embroidered with Master Barber, took his place behind his chair once again. Colonel Mitchell was there, along with Marcus and several other Marines. The mayor presented Henry with a key to the city. But the moment that meant the most came when a young boy, maybe 8 years old, tugged on Henry's sleeve. "My daddy says you're a hero," the boy said, looking up with wide, curious eyes. Henry knelt down to the boy's level, his weathered hands gentle on small shoulders. "Son, heroes are the men and women who serve this country in uniform. I just cut hair." "But you stood up for them," the boy replied with the simple clarity that only children possess. "My daddy says that makes you a hero too." As Henry looked around the new shop, at the Marines chatting with locals, at Marcus learning to manage the register, at the community that had rallied around a simple act of kindness, he realized the boy was right. Heroes come in all forms. Sometimes they carry rifles, sometimes they carry scissors, Sometimes they save lives on battlefields. Sometimes they restore dignity in barbershops. The measure of heroism isn't in the size of the act, but in the courage to do what's right when it would be easier to do nothing at all. In a world that moves faster every day, where profit often comes before people and convenience before compassion, it's easy to forget that our choices matter. Henry Thompson's choice to honor a veteran with a free haircut might have seemed small, even insignificant. But sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest waves of change. This story isn't just about a barber or a soldier. It's about us, about how we choose to treat those who have served, those who are struggling, those who simply need a moment of human kindness. It's about remembering that respect isn't earned by rank or wealth, but by character and compassion. How many veterans walk past us every day, carrying invisible wounds and uncertain futures? How often do we have the chance to show kindness and choose indifference instead? In a country where we say we honor our veterans, do our actions match our words? We'd love to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right when it wasn't easy? Have you been the recipient of unexpected kindness that changed your day or even your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to choose kindness over profit, honor over convenience. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in the power of small acts and big hearts. Here on our channel, we tell stories that matter. Stories that remind us what dignity looks like when no one is applauding, and what honor means when it costs us something. Because sometimes the sharpest blade in a barbershop isn't the razor, it's the courage to do what's right.